Close your eyes, and imagine the creak of wooden wagon wheels, the low murmur of voices by a flickering campfire, and the dry prairie wind rustling through endless tall grass. It's 1843. You're standing at the edge of civilization in Independence, Missouri. Before you lies over 2,000 miles of untamed land, stretching all the way to the Willamette Valley in Oregon country, a place you've never seen, but heard whispers of, promising fertile land, freedom, and the dream of a new life. But what those old pamphlets didn't tell you is just how harsh, exhausting, and unpredictable this journey will be. The Oregon Trail wasn't paved with gold or ease. It was built on the backs of oxen, the strength of human will, and sometimes the quiet sorrow of lives lost along the way. This is the story of what it was really like to live, walk, and survive on the Oregon Trail. In this slow, calming journey, we'll walk alongside the pioneers, step by dusty step, and uncover a history that's anything but glamorous. Prepare to fall asleep to the true rhythm of a life lived under open skies, with hardship around every bend, and hope always just over the next ridge. It all began with a decision, and for most settlers, that decision wasn't made lightly. You've lived your entire life in a small homestead in Illinois or Missouri. Maybe the land isn't yielding what it used to. Maybe you've heard rumors of good, cheap land in the West, rich farmland waiting for the taking in the lush valleys of Oregon. Or maybe you're just tired of being told what your life should look like, and you want something different. But make no mistake, leaving everything behind meant just that. Everything. You'd have to sell your home, your tools, your livestock, anything you couldn't pack into a wagon. Families would spend months preparing, buying up flour, bacon, dried beans, salt, coffee, gunpowder, extra oxen yokes, and bolts of cloth. A single wagon, the so-called prairie schooner, would have to carry a family of 5 or more, all their food for 5 to 6 months, their bedding, pots and pans, and maybe a few sentimental items. A Bible, a photograph, a locket. But most luxuries would stay behind. Neighbors often gathered to say goodbye, with teary eyes and heavy hearts. Some would never see one another again. Letters might take months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Once you were gone, you were gone. This wasn't a vacation. This wasn't a move to the next town over. This was a one-way journey into the wild. There were real fears: Indian attacks, disease, starvation, broken wagons, drowning during river crossings, but also hope, the promise of fertile valleys, of clean air and space, and ownership, a better life for your children. Perhaps, in the quietest hours of the night, that was what drove most people westward, not escape from something, but hope for something else. Each person on that trail would carry a different weight, not just their supplies, but the emotional burden of leaving behind the familiar. And in their hearts they would also carry a question: was this all going to be worth it? Now that the decision has been made, the real work begins. And it's not glamorous. It's slow, deliberate, and filled with agonizing choices. You are preparing to leave behind the life you've known for the total unknown, and that means you can't take everything. In fact, you can barely take anything at all. A typical prairie schooner, the covered wagon most settlers used, was only about 4 feet wide and 10 to 12 feet long, smaller than most modern-day bedrooms. There's no room for furniture, and certainly no room for indulgence. Every single pound matters, because the oxen, large, lumbering animals with great strength, but limited endurance, can only pull so much across thousands of miles of ruts, hills, and river crossings. Too much weight, and you won't just go slower. You might not go at all. And so, the family gathers in the barn or in the yard, surrounded by barrels, crates, and cloth sacks. The mother wants to bring her Castilian cook stove. It makes baking bread so much easier, but it weighs 300 pounds. The father gently tells her no. They argue, she cries. The stove stays behind. Children want to bring toys, a favorite doll, a hand-carved wooden horse, and maybe one item is allowed. One, but not two. Not when that space could be used for sacks of flour or ammunition, or spare shoes. You can almost feel the quiet heartbreak as little hands let go of well-loved things. Now destined to be left in a dusty attic or gifted to a neighbor. You'll need flour. Lots of it. Several hundred pounds. Hardtack biscuits. Beans, salt pork. Coffee beans if you can afford it. Salt is vital, both for flavor and for preserving meat, if you're really lucky enough to catch any game. Dried apples, cornmeal, a small barrel of vinegar, a sack or two of sugar, brown sugar if you're smart, because it won't harden as easily. Then there are the tools. An axe for chopping firewood, a shovel for digging latrines or unfreeing stuck wheels, rope, tar, spare wheel spokes, a rifle if you have one, and ammunition, which is heavy, knives, sewing needles, waxed thread, a Bible. Water is too heavy to bring in quantity. You'll rely on creeks and rivers along the trail, hoping they're not dried up or filled with animal waste. Dysentery and cholera will take many on the trail, and they often begin with tainted water. Then comes the issue of clothing. You can't bring your Sunday best. You need durable wool or linen clothes. Not too many. You'll wear the same outfit for days or weeks at a time. Sunbonnets for the girls, wide-brimmed hats for the men, thick leather boots. You'll mend what tears and stitch what frays. There are no shops along the trail, no tailors, no cobblers, only your needle, your hands, and what scraps you can spare. And now, the wagon itself. You smear tar and pitch between the wooden slats to keep water out. You check the iron hoops over and over again. They re-what hold the wooden wheels together. One cracked wheel could leave you stranded in the middle of nowhere. Spare parts are expensive and heavy, but if you skip them, you gamble with your life. The oxen are the engine. They're slow, stubborn, and incredibly tough. You could try mules, but they're costlier and more difficult to feed. Horses, too fragile. Oxen may not be fast, but they don't complain much, and they can survive on tough prairie grasses. You'll name them because they'll be part of the family soon. You'll talk to them, coax them up hills, cry when they die, and many do. Everything must be packed in balance. Too much weight in the back, and the tongue lifts, making the wagon harder to steer. Too much up front, and the oxen suffer. It takes days to get it right. Everything is loaded and reloaded, shifted and reshifted, tied down again, and just when you think you're ready, you realize you forgot something. A pan, a bundle of rope, the extra boots. Do you leave something else behind, or try to squeeze it in? There's no perfect solution, only decisions, compromises, and a deep breath as you climb up into the wagon seat, holding the reins and the weight of every choice you've made. The day of departure finally arrives. It's early, barely past dawn. A pale blue mist lingers over the open field where the wagons are gathered, like the breath of the land exhaling after a long night. Birds are only just beginning their morning songs, but the camp is already stirring. You hear the soft clatter of pots, the gentle clop of hooves, the low rhythmic voices of families murmuring their prayers. There's a sense of hushed anticipation in the air, thick with emotion, hope, and fear. Everything smells of damp earth, leather, smoke, and canvas. You're not alone, of course. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of wagons set out at once. These long, slow-moving lines were called wagon trains, and traveling in a group was the only way to survive. Safety in numbers. Someone might know how to repair a wheel. Someone might have extra water. Someone might be able to help you bury the dead. Because yes, everyone knows that not everyone will make it. That is the grim truth. No one says aloud. A captain is elected, usually someone with experience or military discipline, to lead the train, but democracy still reigns. Each family has its say. Disagreements will come later, but for now there is a shared purpose. Everyone wants to start early. And yet, even on this first day, delays begin. Oxen are difficult to harness. A child misplaces the yoke pin. Someone's wheel is already wobbling. A horse bolts. A barrel of flour tips over and splits. Everyone is already sweating under layers of wool, even as the morning air still bites with cold. Eventually, after much shouting and correcting, the first wagons begin to move. The oxen grunt and lean into their harnesses. The wheels creak forward. Canvas groans and rattles as the wooden frame shifts and flexes under the weight. You can feel every bump in the earth through the plank seat. And just like that, you've left. You look back only once. The chimney of your old home still sends up smoke. The neighbors wave, then turn away. Maybe you'll see them again in the next life. You turn forward and try not to think about it. The trail is not dramatic at first. There are no mountains, no deserts, just rolling fields, fence lines, and spring grass. Birds flit through the trees, and cows watch from distant pastures. But still, it feels different, open, untamed, like you've crossed an invisible line between the world you knew and something ancient. The wagon lurches and groans with every rut. There are no roads, just wagon tracks and the faint scars left by earlier travelers. You pass the remains of a broken cart, its wheels shattered and black with mildew. A sign, perhaps, a warning. The first miles feel exciting. The children walk beside the wagons at first, running ahead to pick flowers or chase squirrels. They don't yet understand how many miles lie ahead, how many blisters, how many sore backs, cold nights, and calloused feet. Their laughter is bright and fleeting like sunshine through leaves. Meals are simple: cold bacon, hard biscuits, maybe a bit of dried apple if you're lucky. You drink from a nearby creek. The water is clear and cold, and you hope it stays that way. Illness travels faster than any wagon. By mid-afternoon, the sun is high and the mood is less cheerful. The wagon creaks louder, the oxen slow, the children whine, dust rises from every step, clinging to your clothes, your mouth, your eyes. You can taste the land now, dry, metallic, gritty. You stop often, not because you want to, but because you must. The wagon tongue needs adjusting. A boot sole tears, someone's child twists an ankle, another family's ox collapses, panting and foaming. They debate, wait for it to recover, or put it down now. No one says it, but everyone feels it. This will be harder than expected. That night, you camp near a creek. Wagons form a rough semicircle. A few people light fires, but most are too tired to cook. The meal is simple: beans if you're lucky, a hard biscuit dipped in bacon grease, water warmed over the fire. You sit on the ground, your back aches, your hands sting, and this was only day one. Still, the stars are beautiful. There's no light to dim them here, only the vast, endless stretch of night sky above. You lay beneath it all and wonder, what will tomorrow bring? Sleep doesn't come easily. The ground is uneven. A coyote howls in the distance, someone's baby cries. The wind picks up, cold and sharp, flapping the canvas above you. The wagon groans like a ship at sea, but eventually, exhaustion wins. You close your eyes, and the prairie whispers. After weeks of dusty travel and exhausting labor, the excitement of adventure had long worn off. What replaced it was an overwhelming sense of monotony, the kind that made time itself feel like it was standing still. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, flat as a tabletop, with barely a tree to shade the wagons or a stream to refresh the weary. It was a land that seemed to go on forever, a canvas of tall grass waving in the wind, occasionally broken by a scattering of bison bones or the wreckage of a broken wagon wheel left behind by some unfortunate soul who came before. Each morning began with the same routine: a crack of the whip, the groan of wooden wheels, and the lowing of oxen as they were driven forward once more. For children, it was a test of endurance and boredom. There were no toys, no games, and no comforts, just the slow trudge of the family wagon and the unrelenting heat of the summer sun. Dust coated every surface, filled every crevice of clothing, food, and skin. It dried out lips until they cracked and bled, and no matter how much water was rationed, it never felt like enough. The wind could be brutal, hot, dry, and filled with grit. It stung the eyes and made breathing difficult. There were no landmarks to track progress by, and no towns on the horizon. Just the whisper of prairie grass, the creak of the wagon, and the rhythmic thump of hooves on dirt. Some travelers described it as walking through a living silence. Conversations became sparse, reduced to grunts and tired murmurs. Even the animals seemed subdued, heads low and movements sluggish. Spirits ran low on these long stretches. The endless plains had a way of getting into a traveler's head. Tempers flared, families fought. Despair crept in quietly, like a shadow that couldn't be outrun. But they kept going, because turning back was unthinkable. Because everything they owned, and everyone they loved, was in that wagon. Because out there, somewhere past the miles of nothingness, was the promise of a new beginning. And so they pressed on, one dusty, monotonous mile at a time. If the open prairie was monotonous, then the river crossings were the complete opposite. Sudden, terrifying, and often deadly. No part of the Oregon Trail filled travelers with as much dread as the wide, rushing rivers they had to cross with wagons, oxen, and everything they owned. There were no bridges, no safety rails, just currents that could sweep away a wagon in seconds, and banks that could swallow a wheel whole in thick, sucking mud. The first sight of a major river, like the Platte, the Snake, or the Green, often brought anxiety. Travelers would halt, assessing the water's depth and speed. Was it fordable, or would they need to float the wagons? Could they wait for the level to fall, or would delay cost them precious time and food? There were no easy answers. Some rivers looked deceptively calm, hiding powerful undertows that could overturn a wagon without warning. Others were choked with debris, or lined with hidden rocks that could split axles or shatter wheels. Crossing was a tense operation. Wheels were often wrapped in tar-soaked cloth or corked with pitch to try to seal them for floating. Wagons were converted into makeshift boats, their contents tied down tightly in hopes they wouldn't spill if the wagon overturned. Families watched in silence as fathers and older sons waded into the icy water, guiding animals across with ropes, shouts, and prayer. Women and children clung to the edges of the wagon, eyes wide with fear, as water rose to the hubs of the wheels, then to the beds, then sometimes even higher, and then, disaster, a misstep from an ox, a wheel that slipped into a hidden hole, a current that caught the side of a wagon just right. Screams pierced the air, belongings scattered like leaves, people drowned. More than one mother held her child's hand one moment, and lost it to the current the next. Even if everyone survived, the damage could be immense. Food barrels soaked and ruined, bedding waterlogged, tools rusted. Every hour spent drying supplies in the sun was a delay, and delays could mean starvation later in the journey. Yet, they crossed anyway, because they had to. There were more rivers ahead, and behind them, there was nothing left to return to. At first, the journey westward might have felt like an adventure, the wind in your hair, the thrill of new terrain, the hope of a better life somewhere beyond the horizon. But that excitement didn't last long. What came next was something altogether different, a slow, grinding, soul-numbing routine that wore down even the most optimistic spirits. Because life on the Oregon Trail wasn't dramatic day after day. Most days weren't about buffalo hunts or river crossings. Most days were the same, over and over again. For months, you woke before the sun. The cold air bit your skin as you crawled out from under stiff, dusty blankets. Breakfast, if you were lucky, was a few biscuits made from sour, worm-ridden flour, and perhaps a bit of dried meat that had started to taste more like leather than beef. There was no coffee, no eggs, just whatever hadn't spoiled yet. The oxen had to be yoked, the wagons checked, the children roused and bundled up, the fire extinguished, and then the caravan would begin again, stretching out across the open plains like a sluggish, groaning snake. And then, nothing, just walking. Hour after hour, you stared at the back of the wagon ahead of you, the same creaking wheels, the same dust clouds kicked up by the animals, the same endless stretches of brown and gold and gray. No trees, no rivers, no shade, no change. You walked beside the wagon unless you were sick or injured. Sitting in the wagon was a luxury, not a right. It was crowded, uncomfortable, and jostled so violently on rough ground that it was easier on the body to just walk, even for children. Some days, the sun baked your neck until your skin peeled. Other days, the wind blew so hard you could hardly keep your bonnet on. If it rained, you got wet. If it snowed, you kept walking. There were no holidays, no breaks, no weekends. The trail was your life, and it didn't care about birthdays or anniversaries or whether you were tired or sick or sad. You walked, and walked, and walked. At night, you made camp again. Boiled water if you had it, cooked whatever hadn't spoiled, tended to your blisters, tried to scrape the dried mud off your boots, and then you collapsed into sleep, sore, itchy, sunburned, and exhausted, only to rise and do it all over again. Even strong marriages began to fray under the strain. Children cried in the night. Old folks fell behind. Tempers snapped over trivial things, a missing pot, a broken wheel, a misplaced blanket. Every day was the same, and every day chipped away a little more of who you used to be. Eventually, the monotony didn't just dull your senses, it dulled your hope. And still, you walked. Of all the perils faced on the Oregon Trail, few were as quietly terrifying, as deceptively ordinary, as the rivers. For modern minds, a river might conjure up scenes of gentle flowing water under a sunny sky, perhaps a place to fish or wade in ankle-deep. But for pioneers in the 1800s, rivers were deadly obstacles, cold, deep, swift, and entirely indifferent to the weight of a fully loaded wagon and the fragility of human life. Approaching a major river crossing brought a change in mood across the camp. Conversations grew quieter, mothers held their children closer, even the animals, as if sensing the looming challenge, became more restless. It wasn't just the physical challenge of the crossing, it was the haunting knowledge that many before had not made it to the other side. Most rivers, like the Platte, the North Platte, and later the Snake and Columbia, were too deep to ford outright, especially in the spring when snowmelt swelled the waters to dangerous heights. The wagons, made mostly of wood and iron, were not exactly waterproof. Cloth covers soaked through, and the heavy gear inside threatened to tip everything over. If the balance was off by even a little, some pioneers tried to caulk their wagons, sealing the seams with tar, pitch, or even a mix of bacon grease and wax to make them float like makeshift boats. Others would disassemble the entire wagon, ferry each piece and passenger across on rafts or hired native canoes. But none of these methods guaranteed safety. Men waded chest-deep into rushing waters, leading oxen that sometimes panicked and overturned the entire wagon. In many cases, rivers weren't shallow creeks, they were wide, fast-moving currents filled with jagged rocks and invisible dips. In the chaos of a midstream emergency, barrels might break loose, trunks would float away, and children, if not held tight, could be swept under in an instant. There are grim records of what happened at rivers. A mother clutching her infant lost grip for just one moment, the child gone in seconds. A wheel gave way midstream, and a wagon tipped violently, pinning a man beneath it. Others were pulled under by the weight of soaked clothing or horses that lost their footing and flailed wildly before going still. It wasn't just drowning that threatened. Waterborne diseases thrived in the stagnant pools and upstream waste. Pioneer diaries often mentioned dysentery flaring up days after a crossing, weakening travelers already worn thin from weeks of hardship. Still, the pioneers crossed. They had to. There were no bridges, no fords marked with signs, and often no certainty that the other side would be any safer. Every crossing was a gamble, a calculated risk that stood between the family and their dream of Oregon's green valleys. In the evenings, after a successful crossing, the relief was palpable. Fires were built, clothes were wrung out, children played again, their laughter shaky but returning. Adults would speak softly of who they'd lost or simply sit in silence, staring into the embers of the fire, wondering how many more rivers lay ahead. And still, they pressed on. The greatest enemy on the Oregon Trail wasn't always disease, or weather, or accidents. Sometimes, it was simply emptiness. The emptiness in a gut that hadn't felt full in days. The emptiness of a wagon larder, once packed with hope and provisions, now reduced to scraps of flour and a few strips of dried meat. The emptiness of knowing that the next town or fort, or trading post might still be weeks away. Running out of food on the trail was a slow, creeping disaster. It didn't happen all at once. It began with caution, smaller portions at dinner, skipping lunch here and there, then it grew into rationing. A single biscuit shared between two children, a mouthful of jerky chewed until it turned to leather, boiling the same bone 3 times, hoping each pot would yield something a little more than water. Each family began the journey with grand calculations, hundreds of pounds of flour, sugar, lard, coffee, bacon, beans, and rice. They carefully loaded their wagons with barrels and sacks, knowing it had to last not days, but months. But the trail wore everything down faster than they expected. Oxen moved slower than anticipated. Weather slowed them further. Sometimes a storm would delay a group for days, leaving wagons mired in mud. Then there were the accidents, when a river crossing swept away a supply barrel, or a fire in camp destroyed weeks' worth of provisions in minutes. Even when no disaster struck, appetites were larger than expected. Walking 15 miles a day in the dust and sun-built hunger deep in the body, children cried for seconds. Men chewed bark out of boredom. Women scraped pots clean, then licked the spoons. Then came the substitutions. Coffee gave way to roasted acorns or burnt cornmeal. Flour was cut with crushed dried roots or even ground up tree bark. Meat, once abundant from hunting, became rare as the game thinned out or travelers lacked the strength to chase it. Wild berries and edible plants offered a momentary reprieve, but they were seasonal and often hard to find. Some turned to digging for prairie turnips or roasting grasshoppers. In desperate moments, settlers chewed leather from belts or boiled moccasins to extract any lingering fat. Dogs were eaten, horses, too. The psychological weight of hunger was almost as heavy as the physical. Mothers watched their children lose weight, cheeks growing hollow. Fathers blamed themselves, lying awake beside empty pans and restless stomachs. Arguments flared, even among close-knit families. Resentment bloomed in the dust. In some camps there was quiet suspicion. Stories circulated of a family that had vanished, rumored to have eaten something or someone. Cannibalism was a whispered horror that lingered like smoke in the wind, not common, but never entirely impossible in the wild silence of the plains. Fort Laramie, Fort Hall, Fort Boise's outposts became shimmering beacons in the minds of the hungry, not for their safety or shelter, but for their trade goods. A single bag of flour could cost a small fortune. A pound of sugar was worth its weight in gold. Some pioneers sold heirlooms, even traded tools or livestock, just for a few precious meals to carry them to the next checkpoint. And yet, the journey continued, because there was no choice. Hunger didn't end with one meal. It merely stepped back for a while, always waiting, always near, a constant companion on the long road west. And each morning, with aching limbs and grumbling bellies, they hitched up the oxen again and walked into another uncertain day. There is a certain silence on the prairie that settles before a storm, a strange, eerie stillness. The wind disappears. The birds vanish. The very grasses seem to hold their breath. And then when you least expect it arrives. Travelers on the Oregon Trail knew this silence well. It was not peace, it was warning. Imagine the scene, the wide open plains stretching endlessly in every direction, a caravan of weary wagons dragging itself forward beneath an increasingly darkening sky. There is no shelter, no trees, no hills, no buildings, just you, your oxen, your wagon, and the storm. Lightning cracked across the sky like fire from the heavens, splitting the clouds in jagged lines. Thunder rolled in great, booming waves that seemed to shake the earth beneath your boots. The rain did not fall, it slammed. It pounded canvas, soaked clothes in minutes, turned hard-packed dirt into thick sucking mud. Wagons halted. Men shouted to tie down tarps, to gather the animals before they stampeded. Women rushed to protect children, to salvage dry tinder and flour from leaking barrels. The winds howled with the voices of banshees, and even the bravest pioneers sometimes lay flat on the ground, praying the storm would pass without striking them directly. Lightning struck the prairie often, and when it didn't just flash and vanish, it set fire. The dry grasses could go up in flame within seconds. Entire wagons were lost in such blazes. Livestock panicked and bolted into the distance, never seen again. Some families lost nearly everything in a single afternoon. Other times, it was hail that brought disaster stones the size of apples pelting down like fists from the sky, denting metal, bruising bodies, terrifying children who had never seen anything so violent. The hail could strip a horse's flank bloody and rip the covers from a wagon in seconds, and then, just as suddenly, it would be over. The rain would slow, the thunder would roll away, the clouds would thin, and in the aftermath everything was soaked, broken, and cold. The firewood was wet, the matches were ruined, the roads had become rivers, the animals were skittish, and everyone was tired. Mud was the next enemy. Wagons sank axle deep, oxen slipped and fell, their sides caked with thick, sticky muck. It could take hours to move a single wagon just a few hundred yards. Sometimes they had to double up teams 8 oxen instead of 4 to drag a single family's supplies out of the pit. And all the while, the cold crept in. There were summer storms, yes, but autumn storms were worse. On the high plains or in the foothills of the Rockies, it could snow without warning. A sudden blizzard could strike in October, blinding and brutal. Many weren't prepared. Blankets were too thin, coats too few. Children huddled together under wagons while mothers tried to light wet fires with shaking hands. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes, and in the mountains avalanches could be triggered by a single misstep in heavy snow. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a killer. But the storms were not only physical, they were emotional. Every storm reminded the travelers that they were at the mercy of nature, that the world they were trying to conquer was ancient, vast, and wholly indifferent to their plans. It humbled them, it terrified them, and it reminded them how far from safety they truly were. Still, when the sun finally returned, it was like a miracle. Steam rose from the wet earth, birds returned cautiously, and the wagons rolled forward once more, their canvas stained and sagging, but still moving westward, always westward. The day began before the sun had fully risen, the air still cool and damp with the promise of dew. For those journeying along the Oregon Trail, this was a time to move swiftly before the sun reached its blazing peak. The vast Great Plains stretched ahead like an endless sea of golden grass, its gentle ripples swaying in a soft prairie wind. At a glance it looked peaceful, almost serene, but for the pioneers, the plains were deceptively harsh. This would be one of the longest and most exhausting stretches of the trail. Each morning, the camp rumbled to life in a sleepy haze. The clank of iron pans, the creak of wagon wheels, and the muffled groans of oxen stirred the morning silence. Children, stiff from sleeping on the ground or tightly packed in wagons, rubbed their eyes and fetched water. Women stoked fires for a quick breakfast, usually hard bread or a bit of bacon if they were lucky, and tried to keep spirits high. The men checked the harnesses, wheels, and gear for any overnight damage. A broken axle or a thrown shoe from a mule could mean hours of delay or days. Once the caravan began to move, it did so slowly but steadily. The oxen trudged forward, heads bowed, eyes half-lidded with fatigue but obedient. Dust quickly rose with every step, fine, gritty, chalk-like dust that got into everything: clothes, noses, food, even water. By mid-morning every face was covered in it. The pioneers wore bandanas and scarves over their mouths to breathe easier, though it did little good. The prairie heat was no joke. With no trees or mountains to break the sun, the land baked under a ruthless sky. By noon, the wagons would creak with protests, and many families stopped briefly under the limited shade of the wagons themselves. It was during these breaks that illnesses made themselves known. Children with heat stroke, elderly travelers with headaches or nausea. There was little to be done but wait, rest, and drink what water could be spared. Wildlife on the plains was both beautiful and ominous. Antelope and buffalo were often seen in the distance. Sometimes herds passed so close that the ground shook beneath the wagons. The pioneers were advised to halt during these times, lest the animals panic and charge. More than one wagon was smashed to pieces by an errant buffalo, spooked by gunfire or sudden movement. But the buffalo also represented food if the men could successfully bring one down. That too came with risk. Stampedes, gun malfunctions, or injuries while butchering the massive animals. The monotony of the plains often led to boredom and frayed tempers. Children became restless. Adults, worn thin by heat and worry, snapped at one another. Songs were sung to lift spirits. Stories were told by fires at night. Tales of other travelers who'd made it, legends and cautionary tales that walked hand in hand. There was talk of mirages and ghost towns, of native encounters that had gone both peacefully and poorly. Storms came suddenly. Thunderheads could be seen in the distance hours in advance, but there was rarely shelter. When lightning cracked the sky and rain poured in sheets, there was nowhere to run. Wagons were covered, but not waterproof. Belongings became soaked. Bedding was wet for days. Fires refused to light. Sickness came soon after, coughing, fevers, shivering children wrapped in damp blankets. And yet, every day the wagons rolled on. At night, the plains glowed under stars, too numerous to count. Coyotes howled in the distance. Insects buzzed, and the wind whispered through the grass like a voice from another world. Families huddled close, weary and sore, but still alive. They had survived another day on the plains, and tomorrow, they would do it all again, hoping they were a little closer to Oregon, and that the trail ahead would be kinder. As the wagon train pushed deeper into the interior of the plains, new challenges emerged, ones that couldn't always be seen on a map or predicted in a guidebook. These were the invisible hardships, the ones that whispered into the ears of tired travelers during the long, restless nights. The wide-open prairie was beautiful. Yes, but it was also alive in a way that could turn on you when least expected. The days had grown longer, hotter. The sun felt closer than ever, and there was no shelter from its relentless glare. The canvas tops of the wagons, once white, were now stained with dust, grease, and soot. Inside them, the air was stifling, often hotter than it was outside. Most preferred to walk, though their boots were wearing thin, and their feet blistered. Still, walking gave them a feeling of control, something, anything, to hold on to. But when the sky darkened, there was nothing anyone could do but prepare. The storms that rolled over the prairie in late spring and early summer were terrifying in their magnitude. There were no mountains to slow them down, no trees to shield or break the wind. One could see them approaching from miles away, a churning wall of dark blue and gray, shot through with flashes of white-hot lightning. When a storm approached, all work stopped. Wagons were quickly drawn into circles or lines, canvas tops secured, and animals tied down if there was time. Fires were extinguished, children were ushered into the wagons, and everyone waited. The wind came first, whipping the grass flat and shaking the very ground. Then came the rain, sheets of it, hard as stones. It battered the canvas until it leaked through in fine mists and streams. Some wagons were blown over entirely, especially those sitting on unstable wheels or packed too heavily on one side. Thunder cracked directly overhead, so loud it made the ground shiver. Sometimes it struck nearby, splitting trees or setting dry patches of grass ablaze. Even in the rain, horses reared, oxen bellowed, children sobbed. There was no comfort, no warmth, no fire to calm nerves or dry soaked clothing, just huddling in the dark, waiting for it to pass. And when it did, the aftermath was no less difficult. The trail turned to mud thick, dragging mud that pulled at wheels and boots like hands from the earth itself. Wagons bogged down, often for hours. Progress slowed to a crawl and tempers flared. The smell of wet canvas, manure, and body odor was heavy in the air. Food spoiled faster in the damp, and stomachs turned at the meager rations. Then there were the creatures. Rattlesnakes were a constant threat, coiled beneath rocks, in tall grass, even inside boots left out overnight. One bite could mean death, especially for a child or a smaller adult. There were stories told in hushed voices of men trying to suck the venom out of a wound, of homemade poultices and desperate prayers. But more often than not, all one could do was make the person comfortable and wait. At night, the prairie changed again. In the stillness after a storm, when the air was thick and wet and heavy with the scent of earth and crushed grass, sleep did not come easy. The strange sounds of nocturnal life filled the air. Coyotes yelped and laughed just out of sight. Insects hummed and whined. Frogs croaked in unseen puddles. Owls glided silently above, scanning for mice. Some nights, sleep was impossible. The ground was too wet, the air too muggy. Backs ached, heads throbbed. Worries twisted in the mind like snakes. Would the wheels hold tomorrow? Would the oxen recover? Was someone already coming down with fever? But amidst all of this, there was an odd kind of rhythm, a surrender. The travelers had come to accept that nothing was certain except the rising of the sun and the need to keep moving west. The trail didn't wait for anyone. It stretched on like a test of endurance of body, of will, of hope. And somehow, despite the odds, they rose again each morning, wiped the grit from their eyes, and stepped forward into whatever the next day would bring. The Oregon Trail was not merely a road westward, it was a long corridor of illness, dust, and desperation. For every picturesque sunrise on the open plain, there were days marked by coughs, fever, and whispered prayers under threadbare quilts. Dust was everywhere. It coated clothes, food, and lungs. It swirled behind every wagon wheel and clung to sweaty skin in sticky patches. It got into canteens and cast-iron pots. Some days it was so thick that travelers couldn't see the wagon in front of them. They tied handkerchiefs across their mouths, but it did little good. The dust invaded the body silently and without mercy. Soon came the coughs, dry and hacking at first, but in some they deepened into something darker. Fevers spiked, eyes turned glassy, and there was no hospital, no doctor, no miracle cure. Cholera was the great silent killer of the plains. It struck without warning. A person could be perfectly fine in the morning and dead by nightfall. It began with cramping and sudden diarrhea, so intense and unrelenting that it drained the body of fluid faster than anyone could replenish it. Lips turned blue, skin sank into itself. Victims writhed in agony on the ground as others looked on helplessly, terrified but unable to help. There was no cure. No one knew what caused it. Dirty water was a likely culprit, but out on the trail, choices were few. You drank from whatever stream or puddle you could find, no matter how many cattle had passed through it before you. Typhoid, dysentery, measles, scarlet fever each had its season, and each could sweep through a wagon train like fire through dry grass. Children, especially, suffered the most. Their small bodies couldn't handle the brutal temperatures, the lack of nutrition, the relentless exposure. Medicine, if one could call it that, was often little more than superstition. Travelers carried bottles of castor oil, laudanum, turpentine, or miracle tonics, brought back east. Some used mustard plasters or bled the sick with razors. Others boiled herbs or prayed over the afflicted. If someone in the train had medical training, even a little, they became doctor by default, regardless of whether they'd ever treated anything more than a broken arm. More often than not, sickness was met with silence. The sick were laid in the wagon, covered with a quilt, and rocked along the trail in agony. If they died, there was no ceremony. The wagon train would stop only long enough to dig a shallow grave. Sometimes a crude wooden marker was made. Other times, stones were placed in a mound, and the family moved on with tear-streaked faces and red-rimmed eyes. Grief had no space to linger. The wagons kept moving. They had to. And yet, amid all this, among the dying, the dust, and the dread, there was a strange kind of community. Strangers shared medicine, food, or comfort. A mother might sit with a sick child who wasn't hers. A man might carry water for someone too weak to stand. In these moments, the cruelty of the trail was softened just slightly by kindness. Each night, as families settled into camp, and the firelight danced on their weary faces, there was a quiet understanding. They were part of something bigger than themselves, a movement of people determined to begin again, no matter how much it cost. Even when sickness made their footsteps slower and their nights longer, the West still called, and so, they answered one breath, 1 mile at a time. If there was one part of the Oregon Trail that made even the bravest teamsters go quiet, it was the river crossings. They were unpredictable, treacherous, and often fatal. You could prepare for months, train your oxen to obey, double-check the wagon's weight, and still within seconds lose everything in the current. The rivers out west were not like the streams back east. They were wide, deep, and fast-flowing, their cold waters fed by mountain snow and spring rains. From the Platte to the Snake to the Green River, these crossings had to be faced again and again, each one more daunting than the last. Approaching a river brought the wagon train to a halt. Everyone would gather near the bank, studying the water. Was it too swift, too deep, too muddy to see the bottom? Men waded in with long sticks to probe the depths. Some walked the oxen across first, watching how they fought the current. Others waited for a ferry or built rafts, slow, tedious work that ate up precious days. And always, the fear lingered. One wrong move and a wagon could tip sideways, filling with water in seconds. Barrels and crates would spill downstream. A child, if not tightly held, could vanish beneath the surface, gone forever in the churning, silty water. Families debated what to take across first. The sick were ferried slowly, laid flat in wagons with canvas coverings. Mothers clutched infants close to their chests. Fathers walked knee-deep beside oxen, whispering commands and trying not to slip. Sometimes entire herds of cattle refused to cross, turning stubborn and panicked at the river's edge. They had to be driven in with shouts and switches, splashing wildly as they kicked and scrambled for footing. A single broken leg, and an animal was left behind. No second chances. When the water was high, travelers took their chances and caulked their wagons like boats, sealing the seams with tar or pitch, hoping they'd float. The canvas was pulled tight over the top, turning the wagon into a kind of makeshift barge. Then it was pushed into the water, oxen swimming awkwardly behind, their eyes wide with fear, and sometimes even that failed. It was not uncommon to find wreckage days later, crates lodged against rocks, blankets tangled in brush, clothing left hanging from low branches. Small graves near the river told the rest of the story, marked with a name or only a wooden cross, quickly carved and already weathering under the harsh sun. But rivers couldn't be avoided. They were part of the journey, a test each family had to face. And so, after the last wagon emerged dripping and caked with river mud, they would pause only briefly. Wet clothes would be hung to dry, supplies rechecked, and the line of wagons would stretch out once more westward, always westward. At night, by the fire, children whispered about the crossing, wide-eyed and solemn. Parents sat quietly, staring into the flames, thankful to have made it through. And somewhere out beyond the bend in the trail, another river waited. Always another. The Great Plains were vast, so vast, in fact, that they swallowed sound, time, and a person's sense of self. After the hazards of river crossings and mountain climbs, there came a different kind of hardship, the emptiness. It stretched out for hundreds of miles in every direction, an endless sea of grass, wind, and sky, and it brought with it a silence that some pioneers found more unbearable than any physical danger. Day after day, the wagon train moved across the open prairie, the same monotonous view on all sides. No trees for shade, no hills for shelter, just sunburnt grass swaying in the wind. The horizon, a distant, trembling line. The sky above seemed too big, like it could crush you with its sheer size. There were days when not a single cloud passed overhead. The quiet was unnatural. Aside from the creak of wagon wheels, the occasional groan of an ox, or a distant bird cry, there was nothing. No bells from church towers, no barking dogs, no voices echoing from busy streets, just always wind whistling across the grass like a whisper that never ended. It was during this part of the journey that many began to struggle emotionally. Children became sullen, grown men irritable or withdrawn. Women tried to keep spirits up with hymns, stories, or stitching, but there was no denying the toll it took. You could go days without seeing anything new. Days without a single tree, a single person outside your own caravan. The loneliness dug into your bones. For the deeply religious, it felt like wandering through a kind of biblical exile. For others, it became a test of mental endurance. Some travelers began talking to themselves more often. Others walked behind the wagons in complete silence, eyes fixed on the ground, boots raising small clouds of dust with every step. It wasn't just the humans who suffered. The oxen grew restless. The horses lost weight. The dogs that followed the train often wandered off, returning hours later with burrs in their fur and eyes full of fatigue. And the nights, those were lonelier still, without the sound barriers of buildings or trees. Everything echoed differently. Coyotes howled from miles away, their cries carried eerily across the prairie. The wind rattled wagon covers and tugged at tents. People huddled together, not for warmth, but for comfort. Under the stars, the loneliness turned to something spiritual. Some sat by the fire in quiet prayer. Others stared upward in awe or confusion, seeing more stars than they'd ever seen before, so many it seemed the sky might crack open and pour light onto the plains. And still, the next day would come, and the view would be the same. It made you think differently about your life, your past, your future, about whether the promise of Oregon was truly worth this ocean of silence and solitude. Still, the wagons rolled forward, always forward. The sky on the plains could shift from serene to terrifying in the blink of an eye. One moment, it would be painted in soft pastels of pink and gold, the sun dipping low over the horizon as families prepared their modest campfires. The next, a wall of black clouds would rise like a curtain across the western sky, rolling forward with silent menace till the silence broke. Storms on the Oregon Trail were more than just inconvenient. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and often completely unrelenting. The wagons, though sturdy for travel, offered little protection from the fury of the weather. Rain seeped through the canvas, soaking bedding, clothing, and supplies. Children whimpered as lightning struck too close, turning night into momentary flashes of day. The thunder didn't just rumble, it cracked, boomed, and echoed across the empty plains like the roar of cannon fire. Sometimes, the storms brought hailstones the size of walnuts or even eggs, pelting the wagons, bruising livestock, and tearing holes in tents. The oxen and horses grew skittish during such tempests, and it wasn't unheard of for animals to break free in terror, running blindly into the prairie night. Chasing them down after the storm became a perilous task in itself. Then there were the tornadoes, dark spirals that descended from angry clouds like a curse from above. Though rare, when they did strike, the destruction could be devastating. A tightly clustered wagon group could be thrown into chaos within seconds. Supplies scattered, wagons overturned, lives lost. But even a simple rainstorm could bring logistical misery. Trails turned into thick, sucking mud. Wheels would sink, animals would stumble, and movement would come to a standstill. Travelers spent hours knee-deep in muck, trying to dig out wagons with nothing but shovels, planks, and sheer determination. And the cold, as the seasons shifted and the trail pushed higher into the mountains. Sudden cold fronts could sweep in, bringing freezing rain or even early snow. Wet clothes stiffened with ice, fingers went numb, firewood became useless unless it had been carefully stored dry. In such moments, even lighting a small fire became a triumph of will and patience. The travelers quickly learned to read the sky like a book. The formation of distant clouds, the speed of wind, the shifting smell in the air all could signal what was coming. Experienced guides and scouts developed instincts for sensing danger hours before it arrived, urging the wagon masters to stop early or to tie down canvas tightly in preparation. But even with warning, there was only so much a wagon and a canvas flap could do. Many times, the families simply waited it out, huddled together in the dark, wet and afraid, whispering prayers beneath the deafening roar of the wind and rain. Yet, after every storm, the sun would rise, the soaked earth would steam as it dried, the wagons would be repacked, the wheels cleaned of mud, and the pioneers would begin again, because they had to. Each storm was another reminder. Nature didn't care about their dreams of Oregon. It simply demanded respect. If there was one part of the trail that filled every pioneer with dread, it was the river crossings. These weren't gentle brooks or babbling streams. They were wide, unpredictable, and often deadly. The Platte, the Snake, the Green, the Columbia Tridge was a barrier standing between the travelers and the promise of Oregon, and crossing them could be a gamble with everything you had. There were no bridges, no ferries at least, not until later portions of the trail where settlements had sprung up. For the majority of the journey, settlers had two choices: cork the wagon and float it across, or ford the river and hope it was shallow enough to make it through on foot and hoof. Corking a wagon was a process both painstaking and desperate. Tar or pitch would be melted down, sometimes animal fat used in a pinch, and smeared thick along the seams of the wagon box. Every crack had to be sealed, every edge tightened. Wheels were removed and tied atop the wagon, and the whole thing became a crude, bobbing boat. It sounds inventive, but in reality it was not. Families floated their entire lives across rushing cold water in a glorified wooden box, praying it didn't tip or leak. Fording while faster could be worse. One misstep, and an ox might stumble into a deep channel, dragging the entire team with it. People drowned, often men, women and children swept away by unexpected currents or pinned beneath wagons that tipped. Horses panicked, wagons overturned, supplies were lost to the river forever, flour bags disintegrating, clothing carried downstream, tools sunk into the muddy bottom. Rivers that looked placid from the bank could conceal powerful undercurrents. The trail taught hard lessons. One moment of overconfidence could mean catastrophe. Pioneers would sometimes wait days for the water level to drop after a storm, camped on the bank, watching and measuring, debating the safest spot to cross. The greatest danger wasn't always the water itself. Fit was what came after. Even a successful crossing often left the wagon train in disarray. Clothes and bedding soaking wet, salt, pork and beans ruined by water, children shivering from hypothermia. Wheel axles swollen and creaking, tools rusted, morale battered. Fires had to be restarted, blankets hung to dry, life in every sense had to be reassembled, and yet, they crossed, again and again. Some enterprising settlers built makeshift ferries, charging others a fee to be hauled across. Others strung ropes across the width of the river, guiding wagons inch by inch, their boots slipping on wet stones. But for the majority, there was no way forward except through the water. As the sun set on another day of peril, the soaked clothes hung from wagon sides. The fires sputtered low, and weary travelers rested beside the no-conquered river. The children, resilient in a way only children can be, skipped stones over the now quiet water, while their parents sat quietly, each one knowing that the next river might not be so forgiving. On the Oregon Trail, the water could give life or take it away. Death was never far from the pioneers on the Oregon Trail. It rode alongside them in silence, a constant, unwelcome companion that made its presence known at the worst times in the chill of the night, the crash of a wagon, or the fevered cough of a child. As the journey wore on, the trail itself became a long and sorrowful graveyard. At first, the idea of someone dying felt distant, tragic but unlikely. But as days turned to weeks and the hazards piled up, accidents, dysentery, cholera, snake bites, drownings, and sheer exhaustion, death became an accepted part of life. It was not if someone would die, but when, and who. When a person died, there was no time for elaborate ceremonies. The trail did not pause for mourning. A shallow grave would be dug off the main path, sometimes under a lone tree or beside a large rock. The body was often wrapped in a quilt or a piece of canvas. Wood for coffins was rarely available. It was too precious, too limited. Even if there was wood, most couldn't afford to use it. To prevent animals from disturbing the graves, families might burn a fire over the burial site, or disguise it by driving over it with wagon wheels, making it look like untouched earth. In some cases, loved ones would carve initials into tree bark nearby or pile stones to mark the place. But many graves were left unmarked entirely, lost to the vastness of the plains and time. The hardest deaths were the children, a baby succumbing to fever, a toddler slipping beneath a wagon, a teenager crushed beneath a wheel. For the mothers and fathers, grief was a silent, burning thing. They couldn't fall apart. They still had to cook, walk, tend to oxen, guard their remaining children, and press forward. The trail did not grant space for mourning. The wagon rolled on. Some families tried to sing hymns at the burial, though the wind often carried the words away. Others simply stood in silence, holding hats to chests, lips trembling but tight. Then came the hardest part, walking away, turning one's back on a freshly dug grave and leaving a piece of yourself behind forever. And yet, for many, there was comfort in the belief that their loved ones died on sacred soil, the soil of the great unknown, the soil of a better future. They imagined their lost ones resting beneath wild prairie grasses, under open skies, free from the hardships of the trail. The Oregon Trail was not paved in gold or opportunity, it was paved in memories, sacrifice, and the footsteps of those who had to keep going, even when their hearts were broken. As the wagons creaked into the dusk, a solemn hush would sometimes fall over the group, a soft sob, a hand resting on another's shoulder, the wind rustling through tall grass, and the understanding that every mile forward carried with it both the promise of a new life and the weight of those who couldn't finish the journey. If the dust of the plains was the constant companion of the Oregon Trail, then the rivers were its most dangerous obstacles. To the settlers who reached them, rivers were both lifelines and threats, glimmering ribbons of water that promised sustenance, but could just as easily bring disaster. There were no bridges, no ferry terminals in the early days, just deep, cold, and unpredictable channels of water standing in the way of progress. Crossing a river wasn't simply a matter of guiding oxen and wagons through the current. Every river crossing was a tense, strategic ordeal that could go terribly wrong in seconds. Some rivers, like the Platte or the Snake, were deceptively swift, their calm surfaces hiding powerful undercurrents. Others were muddied and wide, difficult to gauge for depth or footing. Settlers had to decide, ford the river, float the wagon, or wait for help. To ford meant driving the oxen and wagons directly into the water, hoping it was shallow enough to walk through. Men would wade ahead with sticks, testing the depth. Wagons were lightened, barrels removed, trunks unpacked to keep them from tipping. Women clutched children to their chests. Everyone prayed. Then came the moment of truth. Oxen splashed in hooves, slipping on unseen rocks. The wagon wheels creaked and groaned as they entered the current. And suddenly, everything could go wrong. A wheel might catch in the mud. An ox might panic. The current might be too strong. If a wagon tipped, it could sink in moments, pulling children or supplies with it. People could drown before anyone had a chance to scream. Some settlers tried caulking their wagon seams with pitch or tar, turning the wagons into makeshift boats. But even this was risky. If the river was too rough, the wagon could spin or capsize. Valuable supplies, flour, clothing, tools, might float away or sink irretrievably. Drownings were tragically common. Many families buried loved ones just feet from the banks of a river that had promised only passage. Women in long skirts and petticoats had little chance if swept under. Young children could vanish beneath the water before anyone could grab them. And yet, in the midst of all this danger, river crossings revealed the strength of community. Wagons would wait in line, helping one another across. Stronger men would anchor ropes or build makeshift rafts. Entire trains would pause for hours or days, camped along the banks, just to ensure that every soul made it safely to the other side. Some settlers, haunted by the losses they witnessed at a crossing, would never look at a river the same way again. Even decades later, they would recall the sound of rushing water and the look of terror in a fellow traveler's eyes. But they crossed anyway, because there was no turning back. On the Oregon Trail, every obstacle overcome was another step toward the dream. And every river crossed was a silent victory over the wild, untamed land that tested their resolve at every bend. By the time a family had traveled hundreds of miles along the Oregon Trail, exhaustion was not just physical, it was spiritual. The endless routine of walking, waking, breaking camp, and plodding forward in the same dust-caked boots left bodies aching and spirits fraying. But worse than the fatigue was the ever-present shadow of sickness, the silent killer that claimed more emigrants than accidents, weather, or even attacks combined. Cholera was the most feared. It moved invisibly, creeping through wagon camps and claiming victims in mere hours. One moment, a man might be walking alongside the oxen, humming or laughing with his children. The next, he might be clutching his stomach, writhing on the ground, fluids draining from his body with horrifying speed. There were no antibiotics, no doctors with proper training, just desperate remedies made from vinegar, mustard plasters, or herbal teas. Few worked. Many died. The fear of cholera was so intense that some settlers avoided shared water sources or refused to camp near other families. But the trail was narrow, and the rivers were few. Avoiding contact was nearly impossible. A single infected water bucket could start a chain reaction that decimated an entire wagon train. Other illnesses struck more slowly but with no less cruelty. Dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox made their way westward alongside the hopeful families. Children with flushed cheeks and glazed eyes were rocked in mothers' arms under the open sky, fevered and listless. Many were buried along the trail, their small graves marked by simple wooden planks or stone piles, unnamed, often forgotten. Injuries added to the suffering. Axes slipped while chopping wood. Wagon wheels crushed limbs. A simple scratch could fester and turn septic. Without clean water or sterile bandages, infection was likely, and the result was often amputation or death. Snake bites from rattlers hiding in tall grass added another layer of dread. There were no anti-venoms, just hope, whiskey, and prayer. And then there was childbirth. For pregnant women on the trail, every bump of the wagon, every jolt of the road, could be dangerous. Some gave birth while the train moved, clutching the sides of the wagon, muffling their screams beneath heavy quilts. Others stopped for a day or two, risking delays. A few didn't survive, neither did all their babies. The emotional toll was immense. Fathers watched their wives fade into silence. Mothers knelt by freshly dug graves. Children, once playful and loud, grew quiet older than their years. Grief became part of the journey, folded into the fabric of daily life like dust into their clothing. And yet, they pressed forward. What choice did they have? Each day, the decision to continue was both practical and deeply personal. Some families turned back, their hearts broken beyond repair. Others gritted their teeth and kept walking, driven by a dream, or by the memory of someone they had lost. The trail didn't wait for grief. The wagons rolled on, and so did the living, because the promise of Oregon still whispered in their ears: green valleys, fresh water, land they could call their own. And so they bore the silent toll of illness, injury, and despair, not because they were fearless, but because they dared to hope. After months of dust and death, river crossings and rattlesnakes, broken wheels and broken hearts, the landscape began to change. The towering Rockies were behind them. The air smelled different, wetter, greener. Prairie gave way to forested foothills. The hard earth softened under their boots. And at last, those on the Oregon Trail caught glimpses of what they had only dreamed about: the Willamette Valley. their final destination, and the end of the long and grueling trail. But the arrival was not always triumphant. The land was not fenced, plowed, or planted. It wasn't ready for a warm fire and a soft bed. It was raw, wild, and indifferent. Trees had to be felled. Cabins had to be built from scratch. Streams needed diverting, and every nail, hinge, and scrap of cloth had to last as long as possible because stores were scarce, and money was even scarcer. For many, the last leg of the trail was not an ending, it was a beginning that required even greater resolve. Families who had traveled together for months now scattered to claim plots of land under the Donation Land Claim Act. Each adult settler was entitled to acres of land, but only if they could prove they'd improve it and live on it. That meant wintering in hastily built shelters, with wind seeping through the cracks and bears sometimes sniffing at the door. It meant clearing dense thickets by hand, planting crops in unfamiliar soil, and hoping the rains came at the right time. The sickness didn't vanish just because the wagons stopped, nor did the memories. Graves were left behind along the trail, some with names, others marked only by sorrow. Many who made it to Oregon arrived thinner, sicker, and older than their years. They had endured physical hardship, yes, but also emotional loss, deep and scarring. The trail had taken its toll on every one of them, but it had also built something quietly enduring. Bonds between travelers became lifelong friendships. Children who survived the journey would one day tell their own children of the time they crossed the continent in a wagon pulled by oxen. The journey became myth-harsh, yes, but noble, and those who endured it bore their suffering with the quiet pride of pioneers. The Oregon Trail was not a straight line from east to west. It was a crucible, a slow-burning test of the human spirit. Each mile changed those who walked it, grinding away comfort, polishing resolve, and replacing dreams with gritty determination. And when settlers stood in their new land muddy, hungry, aching, they did so not with jubilation, but with the quiet exhaustion of survivors. Because that's what they were. They were survivors of one of the most difficult migrations in American history. Their reward was not gold or comfort, but land, a patch of earth they could plant, build on, and maybe, just maybe, call home, and for many of them, that was enough.